At 70,000 feet above the Soviet Union, where the sky bleeds from cobalt to black and the curve of the Earth becomes visible, a single aircraft carved through air so thin that human lungs would collapse in seconds. The Lockheed U-2 represented American ingenuity at its apex, a dragon glider with wings spanning 80 feet, designed for one purpose that would reshape the architecture of espionage itself. Below its belly, cameras with resolution so precise they could photograph a newspaper headline from 13 miles up clicked methodically, capturing images of missile sites, airfields, and nuclear installations hidden across the Soviet heartland. These flights were more than reconnaissance missions. They were acts of calculated violation, technological superiority demonstrated with every mile penetrated into forbidden airspace. The pilots who flew these missions understood they operated beyond the reach of Soviet interceptors, untouchable ghosts dancing at the edge of space itself. The program had been born from desperate necessity when American intelligence analysts stared at maps of the Soviet Union and saw only darkness, only questions without answers. How many bombers lined their runways? Where had they positioned their intercontinental ballistic missiles? Was the feared bomber gap real or phantom? The U-2 promised to illuminate those shadows, to strip away the Iron Curtain's secrecy, one photographic pass at a time. President Eisenhower himself authorized each mission with reluctant awareness of the diplomatic catastrophe that would erupt if a pilot were ever captured alive. Yet, the intelligence gathered proved too valuable to resist, each flight returning with evidence that shaped nuclear strategy and military planning at the highest levels of government. By the spring of 1960, these overflights had become routine, almost arrogant in their regularity. American confidence rested on a simple calculation. No Soviet fighter could climb high enough. No missile could reach far enough to threaten these aluminum angels. The GI pilots trained at remote desert facilities, learning to survive in pressure suits that transformed them into astronauts of espionage. They memorized procedures for equipment failure, for navigation emergencies, for every contingency except one that military planners dismissed as statistically impossible. But technology, like empires, never stands still, and the Soviets had been watching, learning, and most dangerously, preparing their response with patient fury. The radar operator at the Kameny Yar station rubbed his bloodshot eyes, convinced exhaustion was conjuring phantoms on his phosphorescent screen. Dawn had broken over the Kazakh steppe with that peculiar crystalline quality that made distant mountains appear close enough to touch. Yet Lieutenant Alexei Voronin focused only on the green glow before him, where a single blip had materialized near the border region like a spark in darkness. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the telephone, knowing that false alarms meant reprimands, but unexplained contacts meant something infinitely worse. The altitude reading made no sense, numbers that climbed beyond what any known aircraft could achieve, beyond even the experimental prototypes whispered about in classified briefings. He cross-checked his instruments twice, then a third time, before speaking the words that would set history into irreversible motion. Within minutes, the secure line crackled to life across multiple defense installations, each station commander demanding confirmation of what seemed impossible. Major Grigory Belov stood in the operations center, watching his staff transform from bored watchmen into men possessed by electric urgency, their voices rising in controlled panic as they triangulated the intruder's trajectory. The object moved with purpose and precision, following a path that would carry it directly over facilities whose very existence remained officially denied, installations ringed with enough firepower to obliterate conventional aircraft yet suddenly vulnerable. Coffee grew cold in abandoned cups as plotters marked the track on massive wall maps, the red line advancing like arterial bleeding across the motherland's strategic heart. Belov knew the Americans had been violating their airspace for years, taunting them with technological superiority. and now rage mixed with professional calculation in his assessment. Fighter squadrons received scramble orders, though every pilot understood the cruel mathematics of interception. MiG engines screamed to life across 3 air bases, pilots racing through pre-flight checks with adrenaline overriding procedure, desperate to reach an enemy that flew kilometers above their maximum ceiling. They clawed upward into thinning atmosphere, instruments trembling at the edge of operational limits, only to watch their quarry slide across their canopies like an unreachable constellation. One pilot radioed back with barely contained fury, describing the contrail etched against the stratosphere, a white scar of American contempt drawn across Soviet sky. The helplessness tasted like copper in their mouths, bitter acknowledgement that their nation's defenders could only witness this violation. The pattern became devastatingly clear as tracking data accumulated across Major Belov's desk, confirmation that this was no navigational error or weather anomaly, but deliberate penetration of the most sensitive airspace in the Soviet Union. His fingers drummed against reports that would climb the command chain within the hour, reaching desks where men made decisions that altered the balance of world power. The intruder continued its methodical course, cameras presumably recording everything below, with mechanical indifference to the chaos erupting in its wake. The communication systems in the underground command center beneath Moscow erupted with traffic that elevated from routine reporting to something approaching controlled hysteria, voices overlapping through encrypted channels as regional commanders transmitted tracking data that defied rational explanation. General Pavel Batitsky stood before the illuminated situation board, his jaw set in a grim line as operators updated the intruder's position with red markers that advanced like infection across the map of Soviet territory. The cigarette between his fingers had burned to ash without him noticing, grey powder drifting onto polished boots, while his mind calculated trajectories and probabilities. Around him, the nerve center of Soviet air defense hummed with machinery and urgent conversations, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the electric scent of overheating equipment. Junior officers spoke in hushed tones, their faces pale under fluorescent lighting as they processed information that suggested their nation's sky had become transparent to American eyes. The general's aide approached with fresh intelligence reports, each page stamped with classification levels that prohibited their discussion anywhere but this reinforced chamber 30 meters below the capital streets. Batitsky scanned the numbers and felt cold certainty settle in his chest like winter frost. The altitude readings repeated themselves across multiple tracking stations, eliminating any possibility of equipment malfunction or atmospheric anomaly that might provide comfortable explanation for what was essentially technological humiliation. 70,000 feet represented a realm where air became almost abstract, where conventional aircraft designs surrendered to physics and pilots required pressure suits just to survive the hostile environment. The general's fist came down on the plotting table with force that made nearby officers flinch, not from anger, but from the crushing weight of implications that cascaded through his strategic thinking. If the Americans could fly with impunity at such heights, how many previous violations had gone undetected by systems calibrated for lower altitude threats? His mind raced through every sensitive installation along the intruder's projected path, imagining camera lenses capturing what should remain shrouded in Soviet secrecy. The room's temperature seemed to drop as someone voiced the question everyone had been avoiding since tracking began. "Comrade General, what if this is reconnaissance for an immediate strike?" The young captain who spoke looked terrified of his own words, knowing they gave voice to nightmare scenarios that kept military planners awake through long Moscow nights. Batitsky turned slowly, his expression carved from granite, weighing the terrible mathematics of response versus restraint. The memory of recent intelligence briefings flooded back, discussions about American bomber capabilities and the narrow window between first warning and nuclear devastation. His hand reached for the special telephone that connected directly to the Ministry of Defense, knowing this. Decision had already escalated beyond his authority. The dial tone hummed with ominous finality as he began routing the crisis upward through command structures toward the Kremlin itself, where men with absolute power would make choices that might reshape the world. The secure telephone line crackled with static as it connected through relay. Stations buried beneath Moscow's ancient foundations, each routing point adding layers of encryption that transformed human voices into fragments of mechanical noise before reassembling them in the ears of men whose decisions carried the weight of millions of lives. Defense Minister Rodion Malinovsky listened to General Batitsky's report with practiced composure, his free hand unconsciously straightening papers on the mahogany desk that had witnessed countless crisis deliberations since the revolution's early days. Through the reinforced windows of his Kremlin office, spring sunlight painted deceptive tranquility across Red Square, while his mind calculated scenarios that ranged from embarrassing intrusion to existential threat. The minister's eyes moved to the wall clock, its brass hands marking time, that suddenly felt compressed and urgent, each second representing kilometers of unauthorized American penetration into sovereign airspace. He terminated the call with Batitsky using coded phrases that conveyed reassurance while offering no actual guidance, buying precious minutes to assemble the inner circle whose counsel would shape whatever response emerged from this violation. Within 20 minutes, they gathered in the windowless conference room adjacent to Premier Khrushchev's private chambers, men whose faces bore the weight of previous emergencies and whose survival instincts had been honed through Stalin's purges and the crucible of total war. Khrushchev himself arrived last, his stocky frame moving with surprising energy despite the hour, eyes sharp beneath heavy brows as he read the situation from his advisor's expressions before anyone spoke. Marshal Sergei Biryuzov spread reconnaissance maps across the polished table, his finger tracing the intruder's path with movements that betrayed barely controlled fury at the technological impotence their defenses had revealed. The premier listened to competing assessments with the patience of a peasant evaluating harvest prospects, his political cunning parsing military recommendations for hidden implications and opportunities that might transcend the immediate crisis. How long has this American been photographing our installations? Khrushchev's question cut through competing voices like a blade through silk, reducing complex analysis to the brutal simplicity that concerned him most. The silence that followed contained volumes of uncomfortable truth, intelligence officers exchanging glances that acknowledged ignorance masquerading as security. Someone mentioned previous unidentified radar contacts dismissed as equipment anomalies, painting a picture of systematic surveillance that had proceeded unhindered while Soviet leadership operated under illusions of protected secrecy. The premier's fist struck the table with measured force, not the theatrical rage he sometimes employed for effect, but genuine anger tempered by strategic calculation already forming behind those penetrating eyes. The discussion shifted from whether they faced imminent attack to how they might transform violation into victory. Khrushchev's political instincts, recognizing opportunity embedded within humiliation if properly exploited. Marshal Biryuzov outlined deployment options for the new surface-to-air missile batteries, technology recently positioned along critical approach corridors with capabilities untested against actual targets at extreme altitude. The room's atmosphere transformed as possibility replaced helplessness, voices gaining confidence as they coordinated response across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory. Authorization came in clipped phrases and nodded agreements, power flowing downward through command structures toward men waiting at missile installations who would write history with mathematics and explosives. The authorization codes cascaded through military communication networks like electrical impulses through a nervous system suddenly jolted into crisis response, each relay station transforming Kremlin directives into tactical reality for battery commanders scattered across the heartland's vast defensive perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Voronov received his orders at the command post outside Sverdlovsk, the encrypted teletype machine chattering out instructions that elevated his morning from routine readiness to potential combat engagement against an enemy whose technological superiority had seemed insurmountable until this very moment. His hands moved across, plotting tables where mathematics became destiny, calculating intercept trajectories for missiles designed to reach altitudes previously reserved for American arrogance and impunity. The bunker's stale air thickened with cigarette smoke and tension as technicians cross-checked firing solutions, while radar operators maintained vigilant watch on the blip that represented violation incarnate, a tiny electronic signature carrying implications far beyond its modest screen presence. Voronov's voice remained steady as he confirmed readiness to subordinates who understood that success or failure would echo through their careers and perhaps their nation's future, transforming them from anonymous defenders into historical participants whose actions would be dissected by strategists for generations. Across the Soviet Union's western approaches, similar scenes unfolded in underground command centers where the new surface-to-air missile systems represented technological hope against aviation superiority that had haunted military planners. Since the previous war's conclusion, Major Zhirov watched his crew prep the massive missiles with movements rehearsed countless times during exercises that suddenly felt inadequate compared to genuine engagement against an actual target streaking through stratospheric heights. The weapons themselves seemed almost crude compared to the elegant American spy plane they pursued, Soviet engineering's brute force answer to capitalist sophistication, compensating for refinement with raw power and mathematical precision born from desperation rather than luxury. Targeting computers whirred through calculations, while human operators provided intuition that machines could not replicate, creating synthesis between technology and experience that represented the Soviet system's fundamental approach to matching Western advantages. Communication lines buzzed with updates from neighboring batteries, coordination transforming isolated installations into integrated defense network capable of saturating airspace with explosive interception attempts. The intruder maintained course with apparent confidence, either unaware of the trap tightening beneath its flight path or trusting altitude to provide sanctuary that mathematics and chemistry would soon dispute with terminal prejudice. Voronov received updated trajectory predictions, suggesting the target would pass directly through his battery's optimal engagement envelope within minutes, timing that felt simultaneously providential and terrifying as abstract preparation confronted concrete reality. His finger hovered above the authorization switch, while seconds compressed into moments of clarity where personal responsibility merged with national duty, individual action becoming collective response to sovereignty violated and security compromised. The radar operator's voice cut through tension with coordinates that positioned the American exactly where calculation predicted, removing uncertainty and leaving only execution between current humiliation and potential vindication. The missiles erupted from their launchers with flame and fury that transformed Soviet frustration into kinetic response, climbing toward thin atmosphere on pillars of fire while guidance systems searched for the target whose destruction would rewrite the morning's narrative from violation to victory. The impact registered first as vibration rather than sound, a shudder that traveled through the aircraft's titanium frame, like the tremor preceding an earthquake, transforming Power's cockpit from sanctuary into trap with mechanical indifference to human survival. His instruments erupted into chaos, needles spinning wildly across gauges that measured systems now failing catastrophically, while warning lights illuminated a control panel, suddenly resembling a Christmas display celebrating disaster rather than monitoring flight parameters. The U-2 pitched violently, nose dropping toward Earth 70,000 feet below as aerodynamic grace became gravitational surrender. Altitude advantage transforming into deadly liability with each second of uncontrolled descent. Power's hands moved through emergency procedures drilled into muscle memory during training sessions that had seemed paranoid hypotheticals until this moment of absolute validation, reaching for ejection handles while his mind calculated survival odds against decompression and cold that could kill as efficiently as impact. The partial pressure suit that had protected him at stratospheric heights now felt like a straitjacket constraining movements that required desperate speed. Rubber and fabric becoming obstacles rather than safeguards as the aircraft disintegrated around him with sounds of tearing metal and explosive decompression. The canopy separated with violent clarity, exposing powers to thin. Atmosphere and temperatures that froze exposed skin instantaneously, while wind blast threatened consciousness with forces that human physiology was never designed to withstand at such velocity. His seat ejected with pyrotechnic violence that compressed spine and organs simultaneously, launching him into void where blue sky and brown earth rotated in sickening alternation as tumbling replaced controlled flight with chaotic plummet. The parachute deployed with merciful precision, a rest harness yanking against torso with force that expelled breath and stopped rotation, transforming fatal fall into survivable drift through Soviet airspace that now owned him completely. Below, the fragmented remains of his aircraft scattered across farmland like technological confetti, classified equipment and cameras becoming evidence for military intelligence officers who would catalogue each piece with forensic precision. Powers hung suspended between heaven and earth, between life and capture, watching collective farmers emerge from morning routines, to witness his descent with expressions mixing curiosity and hostility toward the American, falling literally into their midst. Soviet radar operators transmitted confirmation through channels already buzzing with anticipation, their screens showing the intruder's signal fragment into multiple smaller returns before disappearing entirely from tracking displays that no longer mattered. Voronov's command post erupted in controlled celebration, professional discipline barely containing emotions that ranged from relief to triumph as officers confirmed the impossible had occurred through their actions and mathematics. The telephone connection to Moscow carried his report with words that would echo through intelligence networks and diplomatic channels, transforming morning routine into historical watershed that neither superpower could ignore. Radio traffic filled with search and recovery directives, transforming military victory into intelligence opportunity as commanders dispatched units to secure crash sites before evidence could be destroyed or concealed by the man now floating helplessly toward Soviet custody, and consequences neither side had fully anticipated. The morning that had begun with violation concluded with capture, altitude advantage yielding to ground reality, technological superiority surrendering to mathematical precision and desperate determination that redefined Cold War calculations in the space between missile launch and parachute landing. The silence in Khrushchev's Kremlin office carried weight beyond mere absence of sound, a pregnant pause filled with calculations that transcended military victory to encompass diplomatic warfare, where information itself became weaponry more potent than missiles. Marshal Malinovsky stood before maps marking the crash site, while intelligence reports accumulated on mahogany surfaces, each document representing fragments of American secrets now transformed into Soviet leverage through circumstance and surface-to-air mathematics. The premier's fingers drummed against leather armrests with rhythm, matching his racing thoughts, considering options that ranged from immediate triumphant announcement to elaborate deception that could expose Western lies with surgical precision. Advisors filled the room with competing counsel, voices advocating aggressive revelation versus patient manipulation, military pride clashing against diplomatic cunning, in debates that would reshape superpower relations regardless of chosen path. Outside the ornate windows, Moscow continued its morning routines in ignorance of decisions being weighed within walls, where global fates were determined through conversations conducted in careful Russian that measured words like ammunition. The captured pilot's survival added complexity to calculations originally anticipating wreckage and denial, transforming simple propaganda victory into potential intelligence bonanza requiring different strategic approach. Khrushchev's expression shifted between satisfaction and concentration as he processed possibilities that multiplied with each new detail emerging from interrogation rooms where powers faced questions designed to extract everything American intelligence hoped would die with their spy. The decision crystallized around patience rather than impulse, strategic silence replacing immediate celebration as Soviet leadership recognized opportunity exceeding mere military accomplishment. Intelligence. Officers received instructions emphasizing secrecy over spectacle, containment protocols, ensuring American uncertainty festered, while Soviet interrogators extracted maximum information before diplomatic revelation. Communications channels monitored Western responses with predatory attention, listening for lies and cover stories that could be dismantled publicly with evidence currently secured under military guard at scattered crash sites. Khrushchev envisioned the trap with clarity born from decades navigating political treachery, imagining Eisenhower's denials broadcast worldwide before Soviet revelation exposed presidential falsehood with physical proof and living witness. The strategy took form through collective refinement, each advisor contributing elements to deception that would maximize American embarrassment while demonstrating Soviet capability and righteousness. Telephone calls radiated outward, carrying instructions that balanced military security against intelligence exploitation, transforming crash sites into crime scenes requiring forensic precision rather than celebratory display. Powers remained isolated within custody that combined interrogation with preservation, his value as evidence outweighing any impulse toward harsh treatment that might compromise future propaganda utility. The morning's military victory evolved into diplomatic weapon being carefully sharpened for maximum penetration, patience replacing urgency, as Soviet leadership prepared revelations timed for optimal global impact. The interrogation room existed in deliberate anonymity, walls painted institutional green that absorbed light and hope with equal efficiency, while Francis Gary Powers sat before men whose questions arrived in accented English, weighted with implications extending far beyond simple curiosity. Colonel Andrei Proshkin studied the American pilot with clinical detachment, measuring responses against intelligence assessments that had tracked U-2 operations through fragmentary evidence and frustrated speculation until fortune delivered comprehensive answers wrapped in survival parachutes. Maps covered tables between them, aerial photographs extracted from wreckage revealing Soviet installations, captured with clarity that transformed theoretical vulnerability into documented reality, requiring immediate countermeasures. The air conditioning hummed with American efficiency, salvaged technology, creating ironic comfort within Soviet custody where powers faced choices between cooperation and consequences that remained unspoken yet perfectly understood. Translation officers flanked the interrogator, their presence ensuring nothing was lost between languages as questions probed operational procedures, mission parameters, and technical Capabilities that American intelligence had protected with security classifications, now rendered meaningless by circumstance. Power's voice carried resignation more than defiance, each answer representing calculations about survival versus loyalty in circumstances no training had adequately prepared him for during comfortable briefings at secure facilities half a world away. The scope of American surveillance emerged through accumulated testimony, revelations building into comprehensive picture of espionage operations that had penetrated Soviet airspace with systematic regularity, while politicians negotiated peaceful coexistence with apparent sincerity. Proshkin's questions targeted specific installations, correlating Power's flight path against military sites whose secrecy had been compromised by cameras now resting in evidence bags alongside survival equipment and documentation. The captured film represented intelligence catastrophe from American perspective, but Soviet triumph exceeding initial estimates, each frame documenting their own vulnerabilities while simultaneously proving Western deception at governmental levels. Technical specialists joined sessions periodically, their queries focusing on aircraft capabilities, operational ceilings, and surveillance equipment specifications that Soviet engineers had estimated but never confirmed until Providence delivered working examples. The interrogation generated reports flowing upward through intelligence hierarchies, each summary amplifying implications about American capabilities while identifying Soviet deficiencies requiring urgent attention. Powers existed in limbo between prisoner and intelligence asset, his treatment calibrated to extract cooperation while preserving propaganda value for revelations still being orchestrated at highest political levels. Guards maintained professional distance, neither hostile nor friendly, their demeanor reflecting instructions emphasizing preservation over punishment in custody that might extend indefinitely, depending on diplomatic developments. Beyond prison walls, food arrived with regularity, meals adequate if uninspired, sustenance supporting interrogation schedules that consumed hours daily without physical coercion but persistent psychological pressure. The pilot's isolation was complete, except for sessions with questioners, solitude allowing contemplation of mistakes and fate while Soviet intelligence extracted everything American espionage had hoped would remain buried beneath Siberian soil. The intelligence gathered transformed Soviet understanding of Western capabilities, each revelation requiring reassessment of defense protocols, while confirming suspicions that peaceful rhetoric masked aggressive surveillance, contradicting diplomatic assurances delivered with apparent good faith at international conferences. The Supreme Soviet Chamber filled with anticipation, thick enough to measure as Nikita Khrushchev mounted the podium with documents that would detonate across international consciousness like precisely placed explosives. Western journalists occupied their designated section, notebooks ready to record what they assumed would be routine diplomatic posturing, while Soviet delegates arranged themselves with knowing expressions, suggesting surprises awaited. Television cameras captured the scene for delayed broadcast, their mechanical eyes preserving history as it crystallized into permanent record through words calculated during closed-door strategy sessions. Khrushchev's expression carried righteous indignation refined through rehearsal, each gesture choreographed to maximize impact when revelations transformed assumptions into embarrassments. The translator positioned himself beside the podium, preparing to render Russian accusations into English condemnation that would reverberate through chancelleries and editorial rooms across continents. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, illuminating a performance where truth served purposes, extending far beyond simple honesty. The Premier's voice rolled across the assembly with theatrical precision, initial statements establishing Context about sovereignty violations before delivering the payload that American officials had desperately hoped would never materialize. "The pilot is alive," Khrushchev announced, pausing to let translation catch up while watching Western faces register implications cascading through their diplomatic calculations like dominoes toppling. Washington had issued carefully worded denials about espionage missions, describing the incident as weather research gone tragically astray through navigational errors, statements now exposed as fabrications requiring immediate retraction or doubling down into deeper deception. Photographs emerged from folders, aerial surveillance images captured by American cameras now serving Soviet propaganda purposes with devastating effectiveness during presentations, transforming victims into prosecutors. The chamber erupted in controlled applause, delegates responding to cues while journalists scrambled to file reports rewriting narratives their editors had already prepared based on official American explanations. President Eisenhower received word in the Oval Office, advisors surrounding him with damage assessments that grew grimmer as Moscow's revelations continued through afternoon sessions designed for maximum humiliation. The upcoming Paris summit, carefully planned to ease tensions and demonstrate peaceful intentions, collapsed before it. Officially convened as Khrushchev announced refusal to negotiate with governments that conducted espionage while professing friendship. Diplomatic cables flooded communication channels, ambassadors seeking guidance, while foreign capitals recalibrated positions based on credibility now shattered beyond immediate repair through explanations or apologies. The president's expression hardened with resignation, understanding that intelligence operations conducted in shadows had exploded into public relations, catastrophe undermining years of careful diplomacy. Allied leaders distanced themselves from American embarrassment, their statements emphasizing sovereignty while privately calculating how this debacle affected their own security arrangements. The incident reverberated through subsequent weeks as show trial preparations began in Moscow, Khrushchev extracting maximum propaganda value from power's continued captivity, while Western governments absorbed lessons about operational security and political fallout. Intelligence agencies worldwide recognized that technological advantage meant nothing if diplomatic consequences destroyed strategic relationships carefully cultivated through decades of patient negotiation. The Cold War entered a new phase where trust, already scarce, became practically non-existent as both sides acknowledged the surveillance reality underlying peaceful rhetoric, preparing for confrontations ahead with clear-eyed recognition that espionage and diplomacy occupied the same contested territory. The conference rooms of Langley and Pentagon annexes filled with analysts whose conclusions carried weight measured in budget allocations and strategic redirections as reports accumulated documenting Soviet air defense capabilities previously underestimated by comfortable margins. Engineers examined recovered U-2 fragments that Moscow displayed like trophies, reverse engineering insights into American technology, while defense contractors received urgent contracts for reconnaissance satellites that promised intelligence without diplomatic catastrophes. When failures occurred above contested airspace, the powers incident transformed assumptions about operational security, classified briefings acknowledging that human pilots represented vulnerabilities extending beyond mechanical failure into realms of capture, interrogation, and propaganda exploitation that machines orbiting in space could theoretically avoid. Military planners sketched timelines for Corona and subsequent satellite programs, their proposals emphasizing altitude advantages that placed observation platforms beyond any conceivable interception, while politicians calculated costs against benefits of intelligence gathering that couldn't apologize on television after. Shooting down Soviet design bureaus received unprecedented funding as Khrushchev's government leveraged the propaganda victory into material improvements. S-75 missile systems proliferating across territorial boundaries, while newer designs promised capabilities against threats emerging from American response to their demonstrated effectiveness. Air defense officers who tracked powers received promotions and decorations, their success validating investments in technology that Western analysts had dismissed as inferior during assessments clouded by comfortable superiority assumptions. Training programs expanded to address high-altitude threats. Radar networks densified across sensitive installations, and military doctrine evolved to acknowledge that American reconnaissance would continue through alternative methods requiring different countermeasures. The incident's lessons rippled through Soviet strategic thinking, reinforcing paranoia about capitalist encirclement while providing tangible evidence that vigilance produced results measurable in captured pilots and exposed lies. Intelligence agencies on both sides recalibrated operational parameters, the shoot-down establishing new baseline assumptions about acceptable risks and technological requirements for surveillance missions that political leadership would authorize after Paris summit humiliations. CIA directors testified before closed congressional sessions, their explanations threading needles between operational necessity and diplomatic disaster, while senators demanded assurances that future programs wouldn't generate similar embarrassments during election cycles. The space race accelerated partly through reconnaissance imperatives disguised as scientific achievement. Rockets carrying cameras alongside instruments measuring radiation, while press releases emphasized peaceful exploration rather than military intelligence gathering that actually justified massive expenditures. The Cold War's temperature dropped several degrees as both superpowers absorbed implications of an incident, demonstrating how quickly covert operations could explode into public confrontations, threatening fragile stability. Each side developing capabilities while calculating consequences, with powers trial providing cautionary reference point. Diplomatic channels remained open, but trust evaporated like morning frost under harsh sunlight. Negotiations proceeding with participants, understanding that surveillance continued regardless of summit declarations or treaty language promising peaceful coexistence. The future belonged to technologies that minimized human vulnerability, satellites replacing pilots in orbits beyond interception, though tensions persisted in new forms as the contest for intelligence supremacy adapted to lessons written in contrails above Sverdlovsk that morning, when one man's survival changed everything. What secrets still orbit above us in the silence of space? Subscribe to uncover the hidden battles that shaped our world.